Dear Jean, we've been at the beach all day. The children had a great time. The sunset was just like this. Love from Mary.
For the people of Port, the beach has always been a place of recreation.
Mummy, let's go to the beach,
would be the cry of a child on a hot day. Tippo Hayes, who was born in 1906, said,
"We were always down at the beach, always doing things and getting things. We get bottles, swim out for empty bottles, sell them. We get mussels, fish, so we were always into something."
In the 1880s, people went fishing, sailing, or just walking on the piers. You could also take a trip down the bay on a paddle steamer. In the early years of Port Melbourne, it was not regarded as polite for a person to be openly bathing in the sea. In 1840, Wilbraham Liarde was the first to advertise the attraction of a swimming bath at the Pier Hotel. The small building at the end of the short jetty on the right side of this picture is the actual bathhouse. In the 1850s, several other baths were opened, and one was built near the railway pier. They were at the end of a jetty, halfway between Stoke Street and Knott Street. They were sometimes called the bathing ship, as they were right alongside a barge. In South Melbourne, there was the Emerald Hill Baths. In 1911, the whole foreshore was opened to bathing. The only stipulation was the wearing of swimsuits, which covered the body from neck to knee. In time, it became acceptable for men and women to bathe in the sea, as we know today. The Princes Pier Gang was a group that met on summer afternoons near Princes Pier in the 1940s. By 1938, Port also had its own life-saving club. From 1841, people took to their yachts out on the bay. As early as 1861, there was a grand regatta. The Port Melbourne Yacht Club was formed in 1889 by port fishermen who had been refused entry to other yacht clubs. It has continued to this day, but the club rooms look rather different now. Women are very active in the club. Over the last 50 years, the jolly boat class has been a big feature of the club. Organised sport has always been very important to the Port Melbourne community. The Port Melbourne Cricket Club was the first sporting club in Port Melbourne. There were actually 3 members of the club who played for Australia. Robert McLeod played for Australia first in 1890 and 1891. His brother Charles played his first test against England in 1894-95 and toured England twice. Port also produced an Australian wicketkeeper, James Kelly, who toured England 4 times in the late 1890s and early 20th century. Cricket was a popular game with boys in the streets. There was not a lot of traffic in the 1880s, but the council still received complaints, including this one from October 1884. "There is great danger and annoyance caused by a number of youths playing cricket at the intersection of Bay and Garton Streets every evening, and especially on Saturday and Sunday." Port Melbourne also produced a lady test cricketer. Peggy Antonio lived in Port and learnt her cricket from boys in the street. She worked at a factory in Collingwood, which had a women's cricket team. At the age of 17, she was selected for Victoria and then for Australia. In 1937, Peggy toured England with the Australian team. She took 19 wickets in 3 tests. Her spin bowling deceived many of the English players. The Port Melbourne Cricket Club continues to play on the Northport Oval. For many years, the club played in the sub-district competition. They were runners-up in 1959-60 and premiers in the 1990-91 season. What is now the Port Melbourne Football Club began from a football team started in 1874. It was first called Alma and then became the Sandridge Football Club in 1877. In 1880, Sandridge opposed Williamstown, which could be seen as the first Aussie rules game played under artificial lights. Fires were lit to show the goalposts as it was dark before the game finished. In 1884, the club's name was changed to Port Melbourne. Here we can see the changes from the 1889 team to more recent times. The Port Melbourne Football Club have been Victorian Football League premiers a number of times, the latest being in 2011. Many other football teams existed in Port, some connected to factories, churches or pubs. 2 players from Port went on to play with South Melbourne and won Brownlow medals. Bobby Skilton was born in Port Melbourne and started playing football there. He joined South Melbourne Football Club, today's Sydney Swans, in 1956 at the age of 17. Bobby played 237 games and won 3 Brownlow medals in 1959, 1963 and in 1968. Peter Bedford was another Port boy who won the Brownlow medal in 1970. He originally played for Port Melbourne, then moved to South Melbourne where he played 176 games for them between 1968 and 1976. Peter Bedford was not only a top footballer, he also was a first-class cricketer. As an all-rounder, he played 39 matches for Victoria between 1966 and 1973. He made a century against Western Australia and his best bowling figures were 5 for 40 against South Australia. The game of bowls caught on early in Port. The Port Melbourne Bowling Club was formed in 1883 and bowls were played on the Knott Street Reserve. It has been a very active club up until today. Originally, only men would play, but both men and women have played since 2000, and there are now mixed teams as well. A lawn tennis club was formed in 1884 and was also established on the Knott Street Reserve next to the bowling club. Early tennis players would have looked like this. When the court was moved to the Graham Street Reserve, the tennis club became a separate organisation. Ladies dressed very formally compared to today's tennis players. Here's a team from more than 60 years ago. In 1903, a meeting was held at the Port Phillip Hotel with the aim of forming a golf club to play at Port Melbourne. A clubhouse was built at the Bend on the banks of the river, and the first tournament was held in 1904. There was plenty of sand around the course, and there was a permanent water hazard guarding the final green, the Yarra River. This was the origin of the Victoria Golf Club. It remained in Port Melbourne until May 1927, when a new course was opened in Cheltenham. Trugo is not a very well-known sport, but there are 2 Trugo clubs in Port Melbourne, the Sandridge and the Port Melbourne clubs. Trugo is a game invented by railway workers in the 1920s. The requirements for the sport were based on what railway workers could find in the rail yards. The length of the pitch was the length of a carriage. The goal post width was the same distance as that between seats in the aisle, and the mallet was a sledgehammer. The black rings driven by the sledgehammer through the goal were an internal component of railcar buffers. Over the years, there have been many opportunities for sport and recreation in Port Melbourne. We have only shown you some of the facilities which existed, many of which are still here today.